A quick comment before we go over this game of Firouzja's versus Jan-Krzysztof Duda. Yesterday I released a video where I was pretty critical of Firouzja for playing 250 hyper bullet games in the middle of the night before his round. And while I think it was a mistake, I probably overstated my objection a little bit too much and spent a little bit too much time on my soapbox. But just to let you know, I'm off of my soapbox now. That video has been shelved and we're ready to get back to chess, which is what we're here for in the first place. This is the candidates, and Firouzja is at the bottom of the rankings. So this game is an important game, I think, because it shows a lot of heart from Firouzja. This was a game where he really had to fight back, and this shows he really does still possess that fighting spirit. Jan-Krzysztof Duda has the white pieces, Firouzja has black. Let's jump right in. d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, d5. A queen's gambit declined formation, but after knight to c3, c6, we now have a semi-Slav with this key triangle formation of pawns on c6, d5, and e6. Duda plays e3, knight b to d7, queen to c2, and bishop to d6. Bishop e2, castles, castles. dc4, bishop takes pawn, and b5, bishop to d3. Now we have our distinctive structure of the semi-Slav. Black will try to free his position either by playing c5 or e5 at some point and liquidate white's space advantage in the center. Firouzja plays the bishop to b7, potentially allowing it to open up on the long diagonal. a3 controls the b4 square, so the pawn can't push the knight away. a5, he still wants to be able to expand on the queen side. Then e4, with the threat of e5. e5 from black is the response. Pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, knight takes knight, bishop takes e5. And we're still very much in theory. It's a while before we get out of known theory. But in this position, the f4 square is vitally important. Black wants to control it. White wants to control it so that he can expand with f4 and e5 and open up this position to attack the opposing king. Black wants to keep it under wraps so he can continue to control these key dark squares along this diagonal. So the f4 square is of vital importance here. h3 keeps a piece out of g4. Bishop to a6. Black wants to play b4 and then trade off these important light squared bishops. Bishop to e3, b4. Bishop takes a6. Then instead of taking the bishop, pawn takes knight, allowing the bishop to retreat back to c4, but then cb2. And you have this very annoying pawn on b2 defended by the bishop at e5. Rook a to d1. Hits the queen, so the queen has to move. The queen moves to e7. And then this is still very much theory, but it allows the win of the exchange. But believe it or not, Firouzja knew this position before he got here, as did Duda. Bishop to c5 is the move, skewering the queen to the rook. The bishop, by the way, cannot be taken because if the bishop is captured, bishop to f7 check reveals the queen at c2 against the queen at c5, and black would lose the queen. So queen to c7 is the move that is played. Bishop f8, rook f8. Now g3. White is trying to prepare this move f4. And this position has been reached 11 times. And every single time, all 11 games, it ended in a draw. And also in all 11 games, black responded with the exact same move, c5. And a normal continuation was f4, bishop to d4 check, king to h2, with an unbalanced but still equal position. Firouzja instead plays a very Firouzja-like move, a very aggressive move, not unlike the move he played against Nepomniachtchi. He plays the move g5. Again, the focus is on controlling this f4 square. Definitely a risky move, but a fighting move, and very much the kind of move that Firouzja likes to play. Duda goes ahead and plays f4. After pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, bishop takes f4, white takes b2. And in fairness, white definitely has the advantage here. He has the exchange. He has a rook for a minor piece. He also has some potential pressure along this G file. The only catch is that white's king is a little vulnerable as well. So it's not that easy for white to handle this position, even though he's got an edge. Knight to h5, aiming for these dark squares. He wants to play bishop to e3 check, forcing the king to h1, then knight to g3 check, picking up the exchange, getting it back. Duda plays rook to d3 to help control that third rank and those entry points of the minor pieces. Queen to e7, trying to get the queen over to the king's side, maybe g5, maybe h4. Now here the computers give a number of different moves for white to keep the advantage. You could play bishop to a2, you could play king to h1 with the idea of rook to g1, but the move Duda plays, rook to f2, loses the advantage that he had for the moment. Firouzja plays bishop to e5, hitting the queen at b2 and allowing the knight to enter into f4. Duda plays the queen to e2. Now, it turns out Firouzja could equalize with the move knight to f4, but the complications of this move are incredibly hard to figure out over the board. A computer line, for example, is queen to g4 check, king h8, rook to d7. This gets out of the fork. He hits the queen, but he loses the a3 pawn. And after rook f7, knight to h3 check, the queen at a3 defends the knight. King g2, knight takes rook, and then here white's best option would be to just take on h7. After queen h5, king g7, he would just have a perpetual, just be a draw, but very hard to find that over the board. Firouzja plays the knight back to f6, but now white does have an advantage again with his exchange, but his king is still vulnerable. King to h1, king to h8, rook to g2. Firouzja plays the rook to b8, the idea of finding some activity on the b file. The bishop goes back to a2 to control b1, so the rook can't check on the back rank. Knight to e8, the idea is to centralize the knight, move it to d6. It also allows the bishop at e5 to defend the g7 square directly. Duda plays queen to e3. The idea here is to play the queen to g5 to force the exchange of queens, because since he's up in exchange, he would very much like to get an endgame without the queens on the board. Knight goes to d6. Rook to d1. Here, queen g5 does not work because queen takes, rook takes, the knight can go to e4, and if he takes the bishop, knight to f2, check. So queen g5 doesn't work in that position. Instead, he plays the rook to d1, queen to f6, rook to f2, hitting the queen, queen to g6, rook to g1, also hitting the queen. Queen takes e4, check, queen e4, knight e4. Now, it's very hard for white to keep his advantage here. He has to play just really, really perfect chess. Apparently, the best idea for white is to play the rook f to g2. Here, after knight d6, rook to c1, hitting the pawn at c6 keeps an advantage. If rook to f8, defending the f7 pawn, bishop to b1 was a way that white could keep the advantage. If he takes the pawn at f7, the idea being that if black plays rook takes bishop, it would just be mate, right? But instead, Firouzja would play knight to g3 check, forcing the capture of the knight. He can't play king to h2 and get a discovered check, forcing the capture. Bishop g3, rook takes f7, and this would be an equal endgame, even though black is up a pawn. Knight takes e4, rook f7 is what Duda played in the game. And this allows Firouzja to equalize the position with knight to g3 check, king g2, and now a forced variation leads to a textbook draw. Rook to b2 check, rook to f2, rook f2, king f2, and then bishop to d4 check, skewering the king to the rook. King takes knight, bishop takes g1. And Firouzja is up a pawn, but with opposite colored bishops. The game is a dead draw, and the players agreed to a draw in this position. And let me say, as someone who was rooting for Firouzja to win this tournament from the beginning, that I think this is a good game, maybe even better than if he had had an easy win, because this shows there's still some fire in the belly, there's still some fight. He fought back from a tough position to equalize and get a draw. I hope you enjoyed the game. See you again soon at Chess Talk. Goodbye.